Hey everyone, how are you? My name is Joey Camire, and I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about this idea of designing for divergence. To start, let me just say I'm a principal managing director and part of the founding team at a company called SYLVAIN. We're a strategy and design consultancy. We're founded in 2010, wholly independent, and a certified B Corp. And this slide is meant to establish a little bit of credibility with some of the clients that we work with over the past 11 years before I show you this slide, which I call the triptych of Joey, right? It is equal parts endearing, weird, and extremely impulsive. And the reason why I show this is because we all have this idea of a narrative self, right? The story that we tell ourselves internally strung together between all of our experiences. And for me, ADHD has played a central role in the story that I tell myself. And that's in large part because I am constantly aware of, either through my own introspection or because of how other people react to me, that the way that I process the world is outside of the norm. And that has been always sort of a double-edged sword. It comes with assets and liabilities, right? Deficit disorder in the name ADHD is a double negative. It means that you lack something and that is a problem. And historically, I didn't really know what to do with this. I had teachers that wanted to hold me back a year. I had teachers who wanted to advance me a year. And I didn't really know how to make sense of it as a person. And then at some point, I encountered these ideas within evolutionary biology around the idea of tolerance as sort of tribal societies, and how we as human beings made what they call the great leap forward by increasing our tolerance of people who process things differently. In this case, the theory says that ADHD posed a bunch of evolutionary advantages when you allowed people to stay part of your tribe, because people with ADHD did things like act unpredictably and try new foods to determine whether they were safe to eat. We lost some of our kin in that process, apparently. But we also did other things like being hyper-fixated on changes within the environment, determining that the stream or river seemed lower than usual at this time of year, or a herd of caribou seemed to be acting differently than they normally do. And that same idea of increasing the tolerance for people who think or behave differently had tons of other benefits. It wasn't just ADHD. Our ability to tolerate people with bipolar disorder or depression or schizophrenia created an explosion in art. Our ability to tolerate people with autism spectrum disorder brought huge advantages in the systematization of tool making. Their ability to focus on repetitive tasks, focus on details, find efficiencies, and codify those efficiencies resulted in everything from arrowheads to the creation of the light bulb by Thomas Edison, who was posthumously diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And for me, that was an incredible gift. This idea that my difference meant I could bring something new and advantageous to the table changed the way that I looked at things, and I started to just lean into my own rhythm. And over time, I've been able to build an experience around myself where I could embrace this idea of my cognitive diversity. And in part, that was a product of luck and meeting the right people at the right times and being in the right places. And I know it's also a product of privilege, right? I'm a straight, white, cis man, and I know the advantages that that brings to me in society. But this idea, right, this sort of cliche that we see here, you don't get harmony when everyone sings the same note. While it's a cliche, we know it's true collectively. And that idea of my luck and privilege creating this circumstance feels like we can build teams that embrace cognitive diversity so that the privilege that I've received is a gift that everyone can have. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. How do we design teams? How do we focus as leaders to be able to dance with difference, to create something beautiful and embrace the ways in which we think differently from one another? I want to start with something that's a little bit fun. If you take a moment and close your eyes and try to imagine an apple in your mind's eye. Pull it up. What do you see? Do you see a shape of a comic apple? Is it red? Is it green? Is it waxy? Is it in the sunlight in an orchard? I see nothing. what psychologists call aphantasia, the ability to have sort of blindness in your mind's eye. And I bring this up not because this is necessarily a radical idea that we should all be using in our day-to-day, but to demonstrate that there are lots of ways in which our cognitive abilities and the ways that we approach things are different that we don't apply language for. This sort of blew up as a meme online, and you can find lots of articles about aphantasia now as a result of this woman who sort of sprung it into viral notoriety. But that woman was a designer who also has aphantasia. And what's interesting is she's built all of these strategies around being able to design iteratively, where she's not holding the image of what she's creating ahead of time. She's taking different approaches and has been extremely successful as a result of that. And there are other things too that have popped up into sort of meme viral status, right? This question, do you have an internal monologue? What's interesting is for me, I have a crazy internal monologue. I can have conversations with myself. I can have conversations between two other people that aren't me in my mind, and almost like I'm hearing them talk to each other. I can hear their voices. But my wife, for example, says that she has nothing, doesn't hear anything. That's not the way in which she processes or navigates the world. And while these are fun examples that we can sort of point to, the reality is that our cognitive experience and the ways in which we process the world are made up of a lot of different things, right? Everything from our neurophysiology and the shapes and sizes and orientations of our brain that's born of genetics and epigenetics and our lived experience, right? The collection of data that we've all acquired over our lifetimes, the stories we tell, the environments that we lived in, and our perspective, right? The sort of cultural heritage that we bring to the table. The idea that your culture has different values than my culture, that you lived in an environment that was mountainous, and the fact that scientists are now pointing to living in a mountainous environment actually changes the way in which you think. All of these things come together to build your cognitive style. And the thing is, we know for a fact, lots of studies. This is one study in a Harvard Business Review article that points to increased cognitive diversity results in more effective problem solving and more interesting problem solving. But this is one study of many. It is a known fact that cognitive diversity improves the outcomes for teams and companies. We have all these stories that we tell ourselves about it, right? A young black senator from the south side of Chicago pairs up with an older white entrenched Washington veteran from Delaware with a tragic story, and they come together, and the tension created within those two stories results in great successes, right? Pulling the country out of the Great Recession or building the Affordable Care Act were in part a product of these two people having different experiences and ways of approaching things. There are fun examples, right? Ryan Gosling and Rachel McAdams hated each other when they were filming The Notebook, but the result was a cult classic that people love to this day. Things like the Grey album, the merger of Jay-Z's Black album and the Beatles' White album, things created decades apart in very different parts of the world by people with very different experiences can be merged together into something that has a beautiful tension mixed within it. We talk about the Apollo 11 flight crew as amiable strangers that didn't know each other and had very different experiences and were still able to achieve great success. Even Garry Kasparov creating centaur chess, this idea of any team on two sides of a chessboard can be made up of any number of people, any number of AIs. And what we found is the teams that have the most diversity in both the AIs and the people on each side are the most successful chess players. Right? We know this, and companies know this, and they've known it for a long time. This is an old Steve Jobs quote about what happens when your teams lack diversity. You come up with predictable, stale, linear, boring solutions to problems. And as a broader culture right now, we're having this amazing reckoning with diversity and trying to resolve the ills of our past as a society. And yet, as we do that, bringing together this diverse group of people within a team and then forcing them still into an organizational monocultural approach to problems is not going to take advantage of all of that cognitive diversity that you're bringing to the table. Because process ultimately is about efficiency, right? Process is looking not at outcomes in terms of how wide or interesting or breakthrough they can be. It is about replicating something that you've already done in the past. And for good reason, this idea of process and our obsession with it was born out of the Industrial Revolution, where we were increasing manufacturing at an incredible rate, and we needed to replicate objects that were the same, one after the other after the other. But in knowledge work, in creative work, in design thinking, that's not the objective that you're looking for. You're looking for breakthrough, for magic, for beauty, for something that is going to push us leaps and bounds forward. And process is not going to be that thing, particularly a monocultural process. The thing is, process narrows our tolerance of what we're willing to accept, right? This is the way we do things. If you diverge too far to one side or the other, all of a sudden that's no longer acceptable. But increased tolerance, like the examples I spoke about in the beginning, have this ability to widen our aperture and our potential for breakthroughs, for disruptive thinking, for expanding what is possible, for serendipity. And the thing is, if we can, as organizations, shift our thinking from focusing on approach to focusing on outcomes and changing incentive structures and cultures of organizations to focus on outcomes, we can allow for this cognitive diversity in our teams to flourish. There are great examples of this, right? Google, in its early days, was described by some as a Willy Wonka factory for nerds. And there are these stories about the adults that Larry and Sergey brought in the room to come help them build this company, showing up into a room where Larry and Sergey and another engineer are playing with rubber wheels on paper. And the woman says, "What are you doing? We're supposed to be building a search engine." And Larry and Sergey say, "Yeah, but if we're going to get all of the world's information in one place, we're going to have to scan a lot of books, and the issue is humans are not going to be very fast at that. So we're just sort of working on a wheel page-turning device." But that idea of having the ability and creating a culture that gives people the ability to experiment and challenge the status quo and do things in their own way can result in huge successes. And we do in other places sort of reward and hold up this experimentation, right? This idea of life hacks and the sort of beautiful elegance of seemingly messy solutions that we turn to in social media and praise is something that we can also bring into our internal environments. If you're focused on a team around what is the outcome, not what does it look like, you're going to create opportunities for surprise and serendipity. After all, absurdity is the ecstasy of intellectualism. This quote is really meaningful because there's something joyful about giving your mind the freedom to experiment and to test out new things and to see absurd things and make connections that you were never predicting you could make. And so as leaders, as designers, as technologists who are turning to your own team, the question is, how do you design for divergence? And I can tell you sort of some of the things that I know that you'll experience when examining your own team and what it's going to take to make your teams more divergent and embrace cognitive diversity. The first thing is introspection. It means that you need to be able to examine your own machine, right? The way in which your mind works, what's different, what's not, what do I need? And the way that we do this internally at our company is by having everyone fill out user manuals, not as a mechanism of monitoring the way that people work, but as an ability for them to understand when are they at their most successful, when do they feel like they're thriving, when are things the hardest for them, what are things people might misunderstand or misinterpret about the ways that they work. And then we allow teams to share those with each other so that when they're entering into a new collaborative environment, they can say, well, I work at these times of the day, or I'm most successful in these types of environment, or I need to write on paper, or I'm an external processor while I'm an internal processor. How can we design a work team that's going to accommodate both of us and we can both succeed and thrive? But that also demands an openness in the way that you're working, a sort of a willingness to break outside of your comfort zones and experience different ways of doing things and sort of relaxing the reins of control on the way that other people work and focusing on what you need and allowing others to focus on what they need. But that idea of discomfort is sort of unavoidable. Diversity always brings friction, right? It is people who see the world in different ways, and that friction can be beautiful. And the idea that you need to avoid discomfort at all costs is wrong. The idea is that you need to build skills on your team to confront conflict, work through it, come to agreements, and be able to build systems together to move forward. And the last thing is that cognitively diverse teams need this idea of charity. I think Jonathan Haidt is a person, a sociologist from NYU, who talked about this idea of charitable interpretations, right? Giving someone the benefit of the doubt when they're working or when they're communicating something to you that they need with the most charitable interpretation possible. But this means giving forgiveness to those around you and a sense of understanding and grace to be able to have mistakes in the process of getting to something that is greater when you were approaching it through a purely monocultural lens. And I can tell you from my own experience, this idea of building cognitively diverse teams has paid huge benefits for me. This is Ben. We started the company together with Alen, and when we came out of grad school, we sold ourselves as a strategy team, which was something that was unheard of, in part because we realized we thought about things so different, and there was so much friction in our working style. And yet at the same time, we realized that we were getting to more interesting, more compelling, more beautiful, more elegant solutions by leaning into the discomfort and finding out what came on the other side of it. The thing is, we know we're going to be embracing a time with more diversity on our teams. And there's sort of this question of, will you embrace diversity not just as sort of a nice concept and bringing equity to people, but also as an ability to build something greater by embracing the ways in which we're different and allowing people to thrive by being themselves in the ways that they work. That's it for this part. You can find more out about us at sylvain.co. We also have a weekly newsletter around sort of giving actionable insights to things that we're discovering and toying over ourselves every day in progress report. And Critical Nonsense is a podcast that we host every week with none other than Aaron Powers, who we're now going to have a conversation about Aaron's experience in embracing and moving between companies that don't embrace cognitive diversity to a company like ours that does. Aaron, managing director, strategist, wonder person, good friend of mine. I wanted to talk to you.
I feel so honored to spend another day with you like I have for the past 1,000 plus. It's really nice.
Through a screen.
Yes.
The reason I wanted to talk to you outside of being a brilliant, wonderful person is because you've been really open historically and publicly about sort of the transition that you made from past work environments into when you joined SYLVAIN and how the experience of going from very constrictive, restrictive, one way to do things cultures was to moving into a culture that was accommodating and asking you to be and bring yourself to work. And so I was curious if you would talk a little bit about that transition.
Absolutely. I think there are two sort of major chapters almost of that transition that have really, I think, borne themselves out in the way that I now prefer to work, which isn't similar to the way that I used to like to work. I think one element is about getting used to an environment in which freedom is truly and fully embraced. And when you no longer have the sort of safety net below you or around you that says this is the way that you're supposed to do it, or this is the way that you have to do it, you're filled with equal parts fear and joy and elation. Um, but I think that one of the biggest things that started to come out was sort of an awareness of the voice in your head that tells you you're wrong. When you constantly hear basically the Scrubs guy just saying you're wrong over and over and over again, you start to learn to tune it out because you recognize that you're the only one who's telling yourself that. But it's one thing to, you know, sort of face this creative boogeyman down, which is the creative boogeyman of freedom in going into new space. It's a totally different one when you then are leading in that environment. And when you're trying to help others embrace collaboration, humility, forgiveness, trust, like all these things that feel like they should just go on a successories poster become essential to creating breakthrough ideas. And you also end up facing down your own natural inclinations to build people into structure. It's again fighting that voice and making sure that you encourage everyone to go out, do more, try more, and break things.
You've been able to do and you know, becoming a managing director here and leading so many teams and being such an asset to our company is this idea of letting go of that idea that things have to, that you have to have your fingerprint on something to be able to do it. But that idea of saying like, okay, it doesn't have to be my way as long as it's good. I feel like you have an interesting perspective on that.
Not everyone wants to do the work of plumbing the depths of their soul in every minutia of every conversation because it's draining, it's inconvenient, and it's a lot for everybody. The benefit is that, you know, if you have a much better sense of your own motivations, if you have a better sense of what those voices are, as RuPaul might put it, your own inner saboteur, if you have that voice on lock, you have a much greater likelihood of being able to invite people into your thinking and to recognize that, especially in knowledge work, your value isn't the content that you create or the piece that you present. It's the intellectual, emotional influence that you're able to afford others. If you're able to push others, if you're able to help others, you are able to unlock new solutions. And understanding that that's actually the work, not the words on the page, is also a really big unlock to creating an environment in which everyone feels free expressing themselves and actually feels that that's their job, not just an option.
Within this knowledge work realm, and certainly within creative work, almost always it's a collaborative endeavor, right? And this idea of asking someone to bring themselves, but also creating the space for them to bring themselves. And that idea of, I think, intellectual and emotional safety is really important. And I'm curious if you have any like tricks or tools. You know, there's no such thing as a silver bullet, but at the same time, maybe from the perspective that you sort of go through it philosophically, you know, how do you approach something like that?
One of the first things that I always remember is that not everyone has the same amount to lose in bringing themselves to work every day. There are systems and strictures in place that have other folks further down the field, that if you let your freak flag fly and someone doesn't like it, you can really end up in a place that you didn't want to be, and not making as much progress as you wanted to. So I like to focus a lot of energy on the simple active listening and active forms of respect. I find it really important to appreciate and acknowledge and really celebrate the differences that I see, to really seize the outlying moments and help folks see that those moments that seem far away from the norm, far away from the median, are exactly the thing that I want to be in the room. if I wanted everybody to think the same way around me, if I wanted everybody to answer every question and every thought the way that I do, I would just, I don't know, be very sad. I would sit in a room and cry alone, because that's not a collaborative exercise. That's not collaboration. That's just self-aggrandizement. So I think that first and foremost, making sure to point out those moments of outlying behavior, thought, motivation, seizing those, and helping folks appreciate how powerful that is. It worked for me, and so I hope it works for others.
What's interesting about you and the way that you talk about things is that you both love process and organization, and at the same time, you're so willing to then break it and step away from it when it needs to happen. And I think that's sort of an interesting discussion within this topic, because not everyone is going to enter into this idea of approaching cognitive diversity in their teams with the same starting point, right? There are aspects to things that we will all have preferences for. But I think this idea of how do you use process as an asset as opposed to like a stricture, maybe you have an interesting thought on that.
You know, it goes, I'm going to use another musical metaphor, specifically when it comes to arranging music, when it comes to writing music. You start playing around with how all these different scales and keys start to clash together. You get excited when there's a key change, when there's something that just moves the entire song up to somewhere that you didn't expect it to go. And I truly do apply that same sentiment to every team that I work on. And I think at our company in particular, every individual project is its own new arrangement from scratch every time, where you're trying to figure out what do we do together? What sort of music do we create together? And all of the same principles come into play. Listening super closely, reacting as new insight and new intelligence comes forward, and trying to not be afraid to screw it up. You're gonna play a wrong note together. It's gonna sound off. That doesn't mean the entire performance is ruined. So I like to apply that music forward mindset in anything we're doing. But I think that if we improvise a little bit, we're in good shape.
This idea that something can be uncomfortable and also good or better or like stronger or allow you to flourish or thrive is sort of a tension point, right? Like where we need to be able to say, like, in a moment, this may be uncomfortable, but in the broader scheme of things, this is better and good, and we all feel happier. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Leaders have to make others uncomfortable, and they have to show their own discomfort. If we don't show the vulnerability and the discomfort, our willingness to grow, the sort of humility of the unknown that we are facing every day, then why would we expect anyone else who we're working with, collaborating with, to do the same? One of the biggest unlocks in life is to be able to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because that always means that you're going somewhere new that you didn't know you could go before. So let's do it. Let's make sure that everybody stretches themselves before the tendons snap. Like let's stretch it out. Let's go somewhere uncomfortable and a little bit weird. And maybe we'll all get somewhere new together.
Metaphors.
I got a lot of them.
I think that's a good place to stop it, and maybe we transition over to Q&A.